This is ben.llywelyn, and today I'm talking about something a bit controversial, perhaps. Why should Welsh nationalists not be so supportive of Scottish independence? Why is it not really in our country's, Wales's, best interests? There's some substantial reasons to consider that, and I'll go through that with you now. To understand where we are, we have to understand where we've been and how we got here. So I'm going to go through each, Scotland, England, and Wales, briefly, to understand how the political situation over the last 100 years got to where it is now. I don't think the British establishment quite understands the gravitas of the situation in Scotland. The Scottish National Party, the ones calling for the independence of Scotland, are winning 45% of the vote in Scotland. Now, if you compare that to 1910 in Ireland, the Scottish Parliamentary Party, which were winning before the more extremist Sinn Féin came in, they were at 43.9% of the vote in 1910. And then after all that happened in the intermittent years in 1918, just before everything blew up and went a bit pots and pans nuts, Sinn Féin went up to 46.9%. So Scotland at this very moment is in a social situation of conviction over independence, where Ireland was between 1910 and 1918. That's quite significant. It's quite terrifying in some ways, but I don't think that Scottish nationalism has any heritage or sense of the violence that Irish nationalism of that era had, or small outbursts of Welsh nationalism had. And there's a very steep reason for that, and that's one of the reasons that Wales should be very wary, and I'll get to that in a moment. The point is that Scotland is on the verge of a social movement that I don't think it can be stopped unless something quite heavy-handed comes into play on the side of England, something quite like General Franco's Spain, though that's not very English. But something of that nature could erupt in England simply because of their history and heritage in politics. If you take Scotland out of how the UK's voted and, well, most of it's England, then the Tories win basically every single time over the last 100 years, except for this little blip after the Second World War here. And Scotland has not voted Conservative since 1955. Wales, they've never voted Conservative. Now, that's not to say that there's not a significant chunk of people who are Tories or Conservative or other variations of Conservative in both of those countries. There absolutely are, and that's part of Scottishness, and it's part of Welshness. But they've not, as a mass, voted that way. Yet England does every single time. Except, here, I'll show you this. There's been 5 instances over the last 100 years when England has voted majority Labour, not Conservative. The Conservative vote does not really go much below 40% ever in England. In Scotland and Wales, that's very different. It's a fluke if it approaches anything near 40% in either of those two. In fact, I don't think it ever has in Wales. It does fluctuate between 25 and 35% often, but to go as high as 40% would just not happen. Meanwhile, that's the norm in England. And there's this sense that we're British when they're trying to say that they're English, and there's not this understanding that those two are different, and that is what, in a sense, led to Brexit. And that's another thing. I gave another video where I would explain that English nationalism expressing itself as Britishness is what caused a lot of Brexit, and is what caused Welsh and Scottish nationalism also. So England votes Conservative, which is very, very different to Scotland, and I don't see any olive branch of reconciliation from England on their part to say, we're sorry, we understand that you don't get the government you vote for. There's no apology coming. The future of Scotland is very uncertain because the English Parliament, well, there is no English Parliament, that's another issue. And yet there is, isn't there? But They are in court at this moment to say whether they can legally deny the Scots an independence referendum. The fact that this even has to go to court indicates the attitude. Now, I'm not saying anything in favour or against Scottish independence here. That's not in Wales's best interest, which I'll get to in a moment. I'm saying that the attitude, especially the South English in this regard and the Conservative Party, is what is causing Scottish nationalism in the first place. And so this issue is not going away for Wales. And I think Welsh nationalists are being incredibly naive. As I said, Wales has never majority voted Conservative ever since those who were able to vote was expanded, the pool of them was. Wales is consolidated in power by the Labour Party since 100 years. Prior to that, it was a bastion of liberalism. I think that went on for 50 years or so. You had the Welsh Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, who reinvigorated Welsh identity, which I'll get to in a moment. But the Welsh have voted Labour for 100 years, and they've not really gotten that many Labour governments returned to them from the British Parliament, which is making a lot of Welsh feel, if that's how we're voting and we're not getting what we want. So I understand why people lean towards Welsh nationalism from that regard. There are other viewpoints. Now this is about Wales, so you've got a basic understanding of England and Scotland politically, and those two were joined in a union. Wales wasn't. It was physically military conquered in a brutal act of conquest by King Edward. I might make a video on him about why he was a psychopath with daddy issues. What do you think? Should I? Let me know down below. And I just want to run through a fact that the Welsh, we've never had respite from constant pressure of attack in our entire history, apart from a few brief blips. And I'll run through that now because it emphasizes why we need time to heal and grow our strength as a country. You don't step into a boxing match just after waking up from a coma. Wales emerged as the native Britons, or the Romano-Britons, the fusion of the Roman Empire and the native British culture, braced itself and gradually formed a more solidified identity out of the rupture of losing control over England in the fall of the Roman Empire, and gradually the Old North as well. And from that stage, that initial Saxon invasion, all the way through to today, we've not had many stages of respite, peace, or general security of our culture not being completely extinguished by forces elsewhere coming into our country. So you had the initial Saxon invasions, which gave us Ovus Dyke eventually. That's what that kind of was. It was the solidifying of a border after the Welsh actually pushed the Mercians back out of Powys. The Irish invaded and the Welsh pushed them out. Then the Mercians re-solidified and the Welsh were battling themselves. And the Norse, so the Vikings came. And then Hywel, this king echoed in an era of peace that was unparalleled. But then you had several hundred years, and with the French coming in, who became the English, and that whole back and forth warfare for 200 years. And then you had a legal apartheid, a social apartheid, and a linguistic apartheid, which lasted over 100 years, and then the Glendower Revolt, which then left Wales in waste for the better part of a century, and then the Tudors coming in and we joining a family which then turned against Wales and abolished our native laws and native religion and annexed Wales out of existence, which meant that the bourgeois, of course, well, any bourgeois does eventually, accedes to the dominant conventionality to keep rank and status. And so gradually our culture was dependent upon the peasantry. That's frankly how a lot of patois-like words have entered Welsh so steadily. It's like a drip tap upon our culture. We've never had respite, genuinely, knowing that our culture was safe and protected from being absorbed out of existence or frankly wiped out of existence militarily. But David Lloyd George came along and boosted it a bit towards the end of the Liberal era, which was quite significant in Wales's case. The Liberals in general in Wales are not given as much credit as they should be. And I don't think people give David Lloyd George the credit that he deserves in Welsh culture itself. Though thankfully we have this statue of him in Caernarfon. But we're still not at this point in 1911 getting security of our culture secret high, ensuring secret high to ensure that Welsh culture is safe and protected and assured some respite from the constant barrage of Anglicization. In the Victorian era, there was a significant influx of tourism efforts to, Anglicize Wales in many cases. Llandudno was wiped out, replanted, the natives forced out of the Caerhedon, the peninsula that Llandudno was on, and relocated some of them to Madoc Street, almost like a pinned-in ghetto for the Welsh, so the English tourists didn't have to see them. But I'll mention the tourism bit in a moment. Wales voted Labour through all of this time, as I said, and then in the end of the 20th century, something miraculous happened. Only 18 years or so after voting no for self-rule, the Welsh turned around and by the sliver of a coin, voted yes. An astounding moment in Welsh history, because if it had gone the other way, that would have probably been the end of Wales, frankly. It had come just in time to ensure that we had the right to exist, because at that moment, the Anglicization of this country was stepping up in the form of holiday homes, and inroads into Wales were a lot more simple, and especially also the influence of English radio, television, and culture. Which brings me back to Wales as it is today. We have a Labour-dominated Senedd. There's been some small increase of Plaid Cymru, the main nationalist party, as you can see from this graph. But it's not taken over Labour, and the valleys especially have almost a heritage of Labour. I know for any of you in America it's strange to understand, but politics in Britain it's almost like you inherit the party you vote for. It's quite strange. It's the thought that I should be loyal to any specific party just because of my family is frankly bewildering to me personally. It's like, no, what is a political party going to offer me? That's not how it's seen in Britain, and especially in Wales. Each borough, each little cultural area has a political identity in many ways. Our Senedd has done wonders for our national confidence, self-esteem as Welsh people. Our Welsh language is heard from Mon to Mynwy all across the country. It is in all parts of our country, and partially because of that confidence, that renewal that having an elected chamber for our country has given us. It has reignited a sense that we exist as a formal body of nationality. And I want to go back to King Edward, the psychopath, who, I should add, when he expelled the Jews from England, he did so from Wales too. And as usual, a tyrant who expels Jews is not usually healthy in the mind. And the marks that he put upon this country are still deep and severe. I compared to what he did putting Cymru into a coma. Those castles that you see when you come into Wales, that majestic beauty that people romanticize, those are symbols of the most brutal conquest that perhaps Western Europe saw in the entire Middle Ages. It's a testimony as well to Welsh resistance, but we tend to forget how much we did resist. And that's why we need to be aware that we're still healing. We've forgotten a lot of our own culture. We suffer from cultural amnesia. We don't celebrate many of our own national heroes. They've been forgotten. And we, having been put into that coma, are still regathering our strength as a nation. We're healing. Only now have we gotten an opera house. Only now, in the 21st century, are we discussing links between North and South. Only now, 150 years after educators spoke of making Wales a truly bilingual nation, are we beginning to take steps, the most basic ones, for it. Only now are we saying, well, these anglicized place names where you just change one letter to make it in English, that's a bit silly, isn't it? Do we really need these on our signs when the native name for that place is obviously Welsh? Only now do you have groups and movements like Yes Cymru emerging, which, whether you agree with independence or not, that's not the point. Only now do we have people expressing such ideas with competence. And that means that we're just beginning. Because whether or not you vote for Plaid Cymru or not, we still don't have any true voice in Wales that is non-socialist. We still don't have a true movement in many parts of the country, and that's because we have something much more important with which to deal than independence. We have to avoid becoming an independent country that loses our culture. Because look at this map. Those blue areas are where over 50% of Wales is either not Welsh, consider themselves British and not Welsh, or are people born in England. Now, there's nothing wrong with being born in England and coming to our country, but if you move to a country, you become part of that culture, you become Welsh. And many of them are the vestiges of that Victorian era's obsession with wild Wales, the green desert of Wales, as if no one lives here, as if all we are is a quaint cottage holiday card. That's the view many of those people who have voted Tory in South England for 200 years have of us, a pleasant little holiday retreat. That all those centuries of fighting to survive don't actually count for culture or nationality. And it's quite worse than this map here. Just look at this map and think of Ireland. Because unlike Scotland, Wales and Ireland both have a history of violent resistance, because there's the thought that we could cease to exist as a people. That never really happened in Scotland. And why is that? It's because Scotland, and their language Scots, comes from the same root as English, Frisian and Dutch. They are the Anglic peoples. They are a common basket, a tribe. The Welsh are not part of that cultural inheritance. We are something completely grown of a different root. And that awareness that we could be extinguished, not just us, but our entire root, the branch of our culture from which we came, has created violent resistance in the past, not just maybe in Glendower, the arson attacks or the bombings near Chwerin, but there's been talk of militant resistance in Wales, a history of it more so than was ever really seen in Scotland in the modern era. It gets more steeply stark and dark than that 50% in those pockets of Wales who do not even consider themselves Welsh. When you drop it down to 40%, this is the map of Wales, which does not consider itself to be Welsh. That's quite worrying, and we need to be aware that if Scotland goes, we have to deal with that, and there's no way around dealing with that. That is what you saw on that map. That is what swung Brexit in our country. So we can see clearly it's already swung the vote on an identity issue once, leading to great harm in our country, and it can do so again. And frankly, if Scotland goes too soon, it will. And because we're just emerging out of that coma, growing our institution, growing our synod, growing our strength, we are not ready yet to fight that if we have to and win. Yet, we're almost there. We're getting there. We need to grow more. We need our Senedd to grow more. We need to go through another Labour government in England, under which times we usually become stronger as a people. Supporting so publicly Scotland becoming independent is not in our best interest at the moment. The best option is for us to grow strength for another 20, 30 years, solidify our institution, grow our language, pass more legislation like we've just done, limiting holiday homes and promoting native Welsh culture, business, especially aspirational young business owners in Wales through the medium of Welsh, to grow our language and our commerce on Welsh terms under Welsh governance and laws. Because what's coming when Scotland goes is a fight that this country has not seen in 600 years, and we're still recovering. And so my suggestion, my idea for you, if you are a Welsh nationalist listening to this, take all of that energy and focus it instead on those demographics I showed you, where there's pockets, huge pockets of our country which do not even consider themselves to be Welsh, and the fact that our language is only spoken by 1/5 of our country. Those two things need to be addressed with the utmost priority. And if those pockets grow, where people do not feel as though they are Welsh, if they grow, then what you're seeing there, I'm sorry to say, is the exact thing that happened to the Gauls in the Roman Empire. That's exactly what happened. More and more people simply did not feel they were Gaulish, and one day they were no longer the majority, and from that there was no road back, and the Gaulish people went out of existence. So I hope if you are a Welsh nationalist listening to this, until Scotland goes, we have the option of focusing on preparing ourselves to be in a situation where we can actually survive an onslaught. There's been 4 or 5 times in history already where the English have flipped out and gone completely psychotic toward all of their neighbors. We have other things to focus on: our culture, our language, and our demographics. Resolving those issues should take priority over independence, because at the moment, as long as Scotland is there in this union, we have a stabilizing force that is going to allow us time to recover from that coma. So we need to figure out ways of using our language and our Senedd to assimilate those areas much better into being Welsh, because the worst thing possible is a Wales confronted with England alone becoming more nationalistic and aggressive when we have pockets in our country which are not Welsh and refuse our culture and say now that this is England. And that could happen because Wales is not like Scotland. We're nothing like Scotland. We're much more like Ireland in some ways. Thankfully, we don't have the religious conflict, but the linguistic conflict is an equal sense of identity and equally as explosive. And if that explosion happens at present, we could be on the losing side. There's a lot of people in these areas who do not feel that their country, nor where they live, is Wales. We need to address that first. And so long as Scotland is not independent, that should be our priority. Fighting a battle which we may or may not win. We should prepare to win. I'm sorry if that was a bit depressing. I just feel that we had better be in a position where we can survive it.